Welcome to The Point of View. This is your favorite current affairs show on television. Here on The Point of View, we pick the right topics, get the right guests, and ask them relevant questions on things that matter to you. Today we're talking to the former DG of the National Development Planning Commission, an economist who has very, very interesting ideas to share about where we are as a country and where our economy is. He's been on this show before. Dr. Nimoy-Thompson is my guest. When we come back, I'll introduce him properly and we'll have a chat on everything: inflation, cost of living, interest rates, GDP, unemployment, and election 2024, and all of those things. Stay with us. Welcome back. So tonight my guest is Dr. Nimoy-Thompson. The first time we read of him many years ago, he was a columnist for the Daily Graphic and he called himself an Africanomist.
Yes.
He, of course,
back in the day,
had very strong policy input in many of Ghana's economic discussions, became an advisor to former President Mahama, and of course now works at the United Nations in some parts of Africa. But he's here as a former DG of the NDPC because he headed that institution for a few years, and he's also an economist. Doc, thanks for joining us. Good evening.
Thank you very much.
How are you doing?
Pretty good.
Good.
Observing things. We've kind of graduated from being active to being passive observers as a new generation has taken over.
Yeah.
So we were watching.
But you are always interested in Ghana because when you make a post, it's always on Ghana.
Very much so.
Right.
Very much so.
Where are we as a country? First, let me start with the country generally, from where you sit and what you hear. What's your assessment?
I think we're in a very dark spot, really, and everybody knows that. I'm just restating it. Perhaps there's a third dimension that we don't talk about, which is what I call the third crisis. And we can get into that later on, the brain drain that's happening as a result of the economic crisis that we are facing now, the debt crisis, the economic crisis, and the fact that what is supposed to be the solution to this crisis is actually aggravating the problem. And I'm referring to the IMF program. It may actually make things worse. In fact, it will almost certainly make things worse. So we will exit the program, yes, but we will almost immediately re-enter. So for me, yes, the program looks like it's actually designed to lead us to the 18th one and possibly 19th and so forth and so on. It's not helpful at all. It's doing more harm than good.
You're serious?
Very, very serious. And I can just give you a couple of examples.
All right.
The issue of the private sector, which, well, let's step back and look at the moral basis of the program itself. Why someone else would screw up the economy, that is the government, those in charge of the macroeconomy, fiscal policy, monetary policy, they messed it up.
Yeah.
And then for some reason they decided to punish businesses and consumers who had nothing to do with that through higher taxes, higher interest rates, and so forth and so on. And now you see the debilitating effects on the business sector. For the past 14 straight months, real credit, inflation-adjusted credit to the private sector has been declining, an average of 18% per month. This is not a solution. 18% per month. The lowest is, I think, 10%, and the highest is 30%. So we are sucking the blood out of the private sector at the same time that we are claiming that we are preparing it to lead to inclusive growth after the program. That's not going to work. If you look at
the past how many months?
14 months straight. 14 months.
So this is Bank of Ghana statistics?
This is Bank of Ghana. It's in the...
Credit to the private sector?
Yeah, credit to the private sector. But the Bank of Ghana's summary of financial and economic statistics is there. They have nominal credit sector, private sector, and then they have real 14 straight months where you are just making it impossible for businesses to perform when they had nothing to do with the crisis. At the same time, you've also raised interest rates supposedly to combat inflation. That's always a dubious argument in a post-colonial economy like Ghana. So you are depriving them of credit. You are also raising the cost of credit at the same time. And paradoxically, most of the banks are actually doing very well in this environment. Why? Because of the higher interest rates that they get from government T-bills. And the Bank of Ghana itself has noted that. So there's a disconnect between the financial sector and the real sector that it's supposed to serve. And this is all what the IMF is pushing for. In addition to raising tariffs on water, with electricity, there was a story yesterday on Ghana Web about a businessman in Kumasi who said his monthly electricity bill had increased from 20,000 to 200,000. I don't know what period. But how can you, and it's happening with businesses all over, and as a result, I'm actually told that illegal connections are going up because we've reached a point where people simply cannot pay. And this is where the flaws in the IMF programs come in, because their whole mantra is the price is always right, so let's just keep raising tariffs.
But let's just take it one by one. Mm-hmm. We had a major crisis before the IMF came. Mm-hmm. We had been kicked out of the international capital markets. Yes. We had massive deficits. Mm-hmm. Inflation was very high. Mm-hmm. Finance minister said we wouldn't go to the IMF. Mm-hmm. The president ordered him to go. Mm-hmm. They, among other things, offered us $3 billion, mm-hmm. of which they were paying in tranches. Mm-hmm. We are due to get the next 360 in a few weeks. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to understand you that this $3 billion they are giving us, in addition to all the conditions that we've jointly agreed, are going to leave us worse off? Is that what you're saying? Or they are not going to solve the problem in the long term? Which are two different things to say.
Yes. The $3 billion really is a drop in the bucket. It's not much. If you look at the amount of money this government has had, I think more than any other government in our history. Mm-hmm. Take, for instance, the Eurobonds, which we started getting in 2007 when President Kufuor was in power. We got a total of just over 15 billion. Out of that 15 billion, 11 billion was procured under this government in 4 years.
Cedis?
No, dollars. $15 billion in Eurobonds starting in 2007. And 11 billion,
out of that 15?
11, just a little over 11 billion.
Since 2017?
2018, 2019, 2020, and then 2021, when the international market shut them off. So in just 4 years, they accounted for just about 75% of the $15 billion. President Mahama and President Kufuor accounted for around 4 billion in 5 years. So look at what happened. In 5 years, they raised 4 billion in Eurobonds. And in just 4 years, $11 billion plus. Not only that, you look at oil sector revenue. In 2016, it was just 200 million Ghana cedis. By 2022, it had risen to 6 billion Ghana cedis. Even when COVID came and it was target, it was around 4 billion. So that's another source of money that hasn't been available to any other government in the past. You look at COVID. We tend to look at COVID purely in economic terms, but it was actually a financial bonanza for the government. You may recall that they actually even said that they exceeded their revenue target in 2020, despite what everyone else thinks. So even though the revenue went down in certain sectors, it was more than offset, especially in ICT, the telcos and what. Remember, they boomed. So we actually exceeded our revenue target in 2020, despite what others think. But as a result of COVID, the IMF also gave us $1 billion in 2020 cash, pretty much, no conditions attached. Now, the significance of that is that in 2015, when we went to the IMF, they pledged, they didn't give us, they pledged, I think, $940 million spread over 3 years. Contrast that with what we got in 2020. It was $1 billion, go and spend for COVID. There was another $1 billion in 2021. Now, if you read
from World Bank or IMF?
No, from the IMF. The World Bank, ADB, EU, theirs were separate. And in fact, their monies, we only talk about the monies they gave us. But
so just to be clear, 2020, IMF gave us
$1 billion.
And then 2021, they gave us another billion.
Yes, but the 2021 figure is critical because it is omitted from the Auditor General's report. And so the total...
That Auditor General's report covered just the 2020 $1 billion.
On the Auditor General's report on COVID expenditures. Now, it comes up to just around 22 billion Ghana cedis. That's because it omitted the additional $1 billion in 2021, even though the Minister of Finance acknowledges the $1 billion on its website. But for some reason, it is excluded from, maybe what's an oversight, I don't know. But if you include that, what we get from COVID financial inflows alone was about 27 billion Ghana cedis. And out of that, they spent just about 42% on COVID expenditures. The rest, they said, went into budget support, and on and on and on. So in terms of money, again, as I said, it's been a deluge. They've had more than any other government. The question then is, what happened to all this money? The bonds, the Euro bonds, where did they go? You hear that they were spent on infrastructure, but when you go through the budgets, we still have shortfalls in infrastructure spending, except for 2020 and then 2021. You drive around Accra and other parts of the country, there's a visible deterioration in fiscal infrastructure. Even lane markings have now been painted over. They're all faded. So you are wondering, and this is it's a question that we need to address, because until we do that, this thing that they now set their sights on, which is revenue GDP ratio that they want to raise to 15, is just going to strangulate the economy even further, because you don't tax your way out of an economic crisis. You grow the economy. Now, the IMF has only 3 years, so they want to just pile up taxes and so forth and so on. But that is not what it is. We even have a COVID levy.
So not in defense, because you've given many numbers. You've spoken about the Euro bond of 11 billion, the 1 billion 2020, 1 billion 2021, both dollars, IMF as well. And then you've spoken about other inflows. Some of the things I've heard the government say, I remember Finance Minister previously spoke about keeping the lights on, criticizing the take or pay energy contracts.
We can get to that, no
That's
problem.
one. I know during COVID, because a lot of people were not working, there was some provision of food for people. All right, that's the second thing I've heard. And then I've heard the government also say that this government has constructed the most kilometers of roads of any government. And they qualify that by saying this includes road repairs. So this is not necessarily new roads, but we had a discussion on this where the claim has been made that when you look at all the roads they repaired, the re-asphalting they did, plus new roads they constructed. This has not been properly fact-checked, I need to say though, but they said that they had built the most amount of roads. So I'm using roads, light, and food as three things I've heard prominently being said, among other things. What's your response to that? And by the way, we are still dealing with just the government. We haven't come to the IMF yet.
Yes.
We're just talking about, so roads, lights on, until the recent doom saw, and then hot meals.
So
and the rest
what
of it.
lights on exactly?
So I recall the finance minister talking about keeping the lights on during COVID, talking about initially you remember there was a whole discussion around the take or pay energy contracts, which they say were paying, locked us into paying certain amounts of money to Ameri and the rest of it. So apparently that was too expensive a deal, and therefore a lot of the money went into that. I'm just mentioning some of the things I've heard them say, in addition to other things.
Okay, let's deal with that. Let's start with the lights first, or even the total expenditure. As I said, they raised the equivalent of about 27 billion Ghana cedis, and they spent only 42% of that. So everything is covered underneath, under that anyway. It wasn't as if they raised the 27 billion and they had to spend 50 billion and therefore they were stuck. There was still more than enough money left from the 27 billion that they raised. If you go through the Auditor General's report, it's 21.8 or thereabout. But if you add the 1 billion which was left out and you use the exchange rate at the time, which was 5.5 something, it will give you the 27%. So that is a non-starter. You spent only 42% of the money you raised, and you claim that you used the rest for budget support. So that's it. Now the issue of the lights and the fact that they had to spend, you see, and this is where the issue of the crisis actually starting. The data shows that the economic crisis started between 2017 and 2019, long before COVID. And I'm glad that my friend and brother Kweku Kwaiton actually granted an interview where he conceded as much, that it was just a matter of time before we had the crisis, that COVID and Ukraine only exposed that. that were very reckless and so forth. I'll give you some specific points in time when the crisis started, and then I'll zero in on the lights that they did. So we look, for instance, mining and quarrying. This is the first quarter of 2018. That's when the growth rate peaked at 31.58%. And thereafter, it started declining. By the fourth quarter of 2019, the growth rate in mining and quarrying had declined from 31 or 32% to 12.6%. This was before COVID. And then you have manufacturing, which peaked in the first quarter of 2017. It was 14.2%. And it started declining, again, long before COVID. It declined to the point where it was 2.7% in 2018, second quarter. It recovered slightly to 6% on the eve of COVID. So again, COVID hasn't come in, but we already see a decline in key indicators. And then electricity, which peaked at first quarter of 2018, growth at 20%. By the time COVID came in, it had actually declined to 0.9 and then 5.9%. Again, without COVID coming in. Even worse is construction. And construction is critical because it's perhaps the most dynamic sector of it all. Well, in the sense that when you make payments into the construction sector, the money goes up and down. It goes to the professionals, the owners,
and
the
laborers and everybody.
Yes, and then the admin staff in the middle, and then the laborers. So when construction shrinks, it has serious implications for that. Construction peaked in the second quarter of 2017.
Serious?
Yes. And thereafter, it started slowing. Now, let me make a critical distinction. There's a difference between slowing and declining. Slowing means that it's positive, but it's declining it's positive, but it's going down. Whereas decline is basically negative. So it peaked at 7.6% in the second quarter of 2017. And then it started slowing until it got to the fourth quarter of 2018. It went to 1.09. And then by the end of 2019, it was negative 4%.
Wow.
So if you read the budget, you see that for the construction sector in 2019, it shrank by 4%. Now, back to the lights thing, and this is very critical because electricity, I don't know if I mentioned electricity, it peaked at 20% and declined to 4%. Now, this is where the politics came in to bite us. Because President Mahama left enough electricity to drive economic growth, including manufacturing. Now, there are some figures that I don't have with me. I can share them with you later on, where the average annual growth in installed capacity was 15% during his period. And we have said that, well, this was meant to solve doomsday. But to keep it normal, let's set it at around 1%, 10%. Instead, it declined gradually to 1%. So imagine your installed capacity growth declining from 15% to 1%. And people are sitting there dropping out, well, he left too much electricity. Where in the world do you hear that a developing country has too much electricity? The reason why to them it looks like too much electricity was because the manufacturing sector was not growing. And the manufacturing sector was not growing because there wasn't enough policies or any policies at all that would then facilitate demand for that electricity. If the manufacturing sector was growing, they would have used that electricity.
This was the era of one district, one factory.
Well,
this is 2017.
That was the slogan, but it takes a while.
They had about 100 and something companies.
Well,
who are 1D, 1F companies, about 140.
Be that as it may, the manufacturing sector was still decelerating. That the manufacturing didn't decline in terms of negative, but it slowed from 14.2% to 6%. At some point, it was even as low as 2.66%. So the bottom line is that the demand for electricity was not as high as it should have been or could have been if we had the right industrial policies in place. And so they then demonized the whole thing and said, well, Mahama gave us too much electricity. Now we don't have enough electricity.
What about the roads argument? You've dealt with the energy argument, the road argument that they build more. And by the way, the major expenditure items on this government's budget in terms of recurring employee compensation has been big, and then interest payments have been large. So interest payments take a large chunk of our, at least our revenues. So interest payments. So if you look at the government expenditure, capex. So for example, 2024, employee compensation is close to 70 billion. Interest about 55 billion.
Yes.
Capex is less than 30 billion.
Yes.
So clearly, the money is being spent to pay workers to pay interest.
Thank you. I'm glad.
On loans taken in the past.
I'm glad you mentioned that. It's one of the biggest structural impediments to fiscal rectitude in Ghana.
Yeah.
Historically, that has been the case. On average, and I can give you the figures, on average, we exceed our wage bill by just about 9%, close to 10% on average, since 2008. Every single year, we've exceeded our wage bill by almost 10%. And over that same period, on average, we've had revenue shortfalls of around 4%. So you see the contradiction emerging. Your revenues are falling short in terms of budget, so actual and budget. It's falling short by an average of 4%, but you are exceeding your wage bill by almost 10%. And then the third element is a shortfall in capex, capital expenditure, which is also around 4%. So it's like the perfect storm. You are not investing enough in your economy, and as a result, you are not collecting enough revenue, but you keep growing your... and now the latest thing in town now is MPs who are taking pictures with people that they got into the security services. I don't know if you noticed that. They take pictures with them to show that, yes, I got them jobs, rather than strategically growing the private sector. And then...
So you are putting more pressure on the wage bill to satisfy a political need, and then you're not investing in capex, and you're not raising enough revenue.
Precisely.
So all of this predated COVID. So that argument is well made.
Exactly. And it's continuing, by the way. I see a slight decline in the wage bill for the estimated figures for last year. We don't have the final. There's been a slight one, but the others remain the same. Revenues continue to fall short, and it will actually get worse as the IMF program is implemented, because the sources of revenue are business activities, growth. And here you are strangulating them by not giving them credit, raising the cost of doing business, tariffs, electricity tariffs, and so forth. So we can expect this to get very difficult as we go on. And then don't forget, initially you talked about the debt exchange. The debt exchange program, and how it basically decimated the middle class. We'll
come to that when we come back. This is the point of view. Tonight we're talking to Dr. Nimoy Thompson about Ghana's economy. He's made an argument that our economic crisis predates COVID, and doesn't think the IMF program is designed to sustainably solve it. We'll talk about that when we come back. Stay with us. Welcome back. Point of View tonight is talking to Dr. Nimoy Thompson, former DG of the NDPC, National Development Planning Commission, and economist in Ghana, talking about this economic crisis. Talks about the three-layer crisis: debt crisis, economic crisis. Now he's talking about brain drain. You were making a point before the break around the debt exchange, but I want to treat the debt exchange as a separate point.
Yeah, sure.
Why? Okay, you've told me that we had a crisis before COVID.
Yes.
You've also told me that
it was building.
IMF gave us 2 billion under COVID, and the other monies came in.
Yes.
But you still think the IMF program is not the solution to the problem, even though they give you 2 billion before, and they give you 3 more billion.
Yes.
What have they done? What have they done wrong?
Two different conditions now. The first 2 billion, 2020 and 20, were pretty much carte blanche because of the crisis.
They were grants.
There were they're not. I don't believe they were grants, but it's like a blank check. Because of the crisis, we're not going to impose any conditions. So we weren't under any program. They just pretty much give us the money, and they were doing that for pretty much
every
all
country.
Countries. Yes, because of the crisis. That is different from the program now, which is a $3 billion.
So what is wrong with the program for which you think it does not solve the problem? By the way, the program, to point, the program is not designed to solve all a country's economic problems.
Precisely.
Because you've been in government with an IMF program,
yes,
which didn't necessarily solve the country's problems.
Yes.
So what's your beef with the program?
Now, that's a very good point. The IMF's program or programs are meant to help you deal with problems in the short term.
Okay.
It focuses primarily on stabilization. All right? Now, it's up to you as a country, as a people, to then worry beyond stabilization to look at growth, transformation of your economy.
Yeah.
We haven't done that. We always stop short of the transformation because the policies on the transformation undermine the capacity of the economy to actually grow once the program has ended. This is nothing new. I just stumbled on a publication in my library a couple of weeks ago called From Stabilization to Growth. This is 2004.
Okay.
It's a
20
publication,
years ago.
Yeah, by the Bank of Ghana. Ishmael Jansen spoke there. He made the same argument pretty much, that we need to link the macro with the micro. But there's a disconnect. Almost everything that's been done under the program, supposedly to bring stabilization, it's actually destroying the capacity of the government to even finance its own.
Really?
Because when businesses are not making profits, how is government going to raise the revenue to finance its debt? This practice of increasing the number of taxes or raising the tax rates have their limits. You are basically destroying the economy from the other end. So
But let's take it one by one.
Okay.
What has the IMF program said? First thing is to do with your debt issues. You've done a domestic debt exchange where you saved allegedly $8 billion. You just agreed with your bilateral creditors another $5 billion debt relief, which is more like deferring the payment to 2025.
Exactly.
26. You're negotiating with your commercial creditors for the rest of your 40 billion, with anything between 11 to 20 billion. So that's number one. The IMF have also asked you to freeze employment into the public sector. The IMF has asked you to do zero financing. So the central bank lent you in excess of 50 billion. Parliament was not aware. The IMF has made you sign an MOU.
Yes.
They're not going to continue that.
Yes. But
These are, from off the top of my head, that how is this a problem? Stop financing your government with central bank, all right?
You left out one part, raise interest rates to fight inflation.
No, did they say that, or they basically say bring inflation under control? I'm talking about the things they insisted on.
Okay.
So they didn't tell you to raise interest rates.
Okay.
Your governor and his MPC team decide based on their, and I'm not holding me for IMF,
Yeah,
that their understanding of
Yeah.
stabilizing the economy is to raise interest rates,
Yes.
allegedly to cool down inflation.
Yes. Yes.
So I'm still not sure
Let's-
how
let's-
the IMF program.
Let's go to the debt, the approach
Yes.
to debt, and this
Yes.
is a fundamental problem across board.
Yes.
Now you have, I mentioned $11 billion and others that
Yes.
have accumulated,
Yes.
and as a result, you couldn't finance it, and now you have a crisis. The first place to start is to try and identify what happened. What was the source of that debt? What happened? So let's say it's $10 million, and you come in and you don't know what happened. You need to find out what happened to the money first before you start punishing the public for that. Because the people who racked up that money, they were just borrowing and making a profit from it and so forth and so on. They've now all simply walked away gently with their hands in their pockets and whistling. They're not bearing any of the cost. It is the public, and especially the savers, the pensioners and whatnot, who are paying the price. So for me, generally, I believe that our approach to resolving the debt crisis is wrong. The first thing you need to do is to identify the various components of the debt, where the money went. For instance, you look at, in addition to the debt, we have the issue of the procurement orgy, let's say, of the COVID era, where people simply became overnight millionaires and billionaires for doing virtually nothing. All this money is floating out there illegally, fueling the inflation. We need to be able to identify the sources of these things and deal with them first before we start imposing difficulties and hardships on other people. The US, for instance, is doing that. I remember during COVID, there were
But is that IMF's responsibility or the government?
Now, it's a good question. The IMF program is structured in such a way that it will tell you to go and bring a program. So in nominally, it's your program. It's not their program.
Yeah.
But it's your program subject to their approval. So you can't say that you're not going to raise interest rates, for example. They will frown at that. And so you are doing it, it's like they are not directly, because in the past they were criticized for that. So you are the one doing that. And so whatever policies you are implementing under the program then becomes harmful. And the IMF in that case comes into the picture because it is an IMF program. That's the point I'm trying to make. And when our approach to dealing with debt sustainability is wrong. One, we haven't identified the sources of the debt, who got what. If you, let's say you borrowed 20 million and some people took away 10 million, you need to be able to retrieve that money instead of finding ways to pay off the 20 million.
But the problem is that the people who took the debt were the same guys in charge of the debt exchange. So there's no way they're going to do what you're asking.
Precisely.
And the IMF cannot tell you who to.
Well, if
the IMF cannot tell you who should be your finance minister or who should be in charge of the process.
So we need to have that discussion.
Because the president could say, they created this mess, let them solve it. Without necessarily the background you're coming from. You're saying, these guys borrow so much money and we don't know what they use it for. I think the president's argument was, look, you guys led us into this mess, so get us out before you give the
whose argument?
I'm saying I'm surmising now because there was pressure from MPP for the finance minister to be removed, which the president did not agree to.
Yes.
Because I'm surmising that his view is that he led us into the crisis, so he should lead us out.
Okay.
Do you understand?
Yes.
So he should start the IMF program and make sure it's
I remember
running
that argument.
before he hands over to somebody. So
Yes.
that's his argument.
But still, there was no responsibility. Again, remember I said there are two sections to the economy.
Yeah.
You have the macroeconomy.
Yeah.
With the Minister of Finance in charge of fiscal and the Bank of Ghana in charge. They're screwed up. Someone needs to take responsibility for that before you go on to punish the rest of the society that had nothing to do with that. And nobody has been held responsible for that. Not in terms of the fiscal, not in terms of the monetary. They are still walking around with impunity. And we've had this practice where you screw up and then somebody else. Why should somebody pay the price for that? So we need to do that. In addition to actually going out of a way to set, because the Bank of Ghana keeps using the term excess liquidity and so forth and so on. What we have is far more than excess liquidity. We have a kind of a waterlogged financial system. There's so much money just floating in the system beyond the normal parameters of conventional monetary policy. And we need to find a way to retrieve them. But no one is willing to do that. Other countries, even the US with all its resources, they have a special task force that's going after people who illegally profited from COVID. I think they've collected $9 billion or something. We need to find a way of sucking that money out of the system and holding people accountable and not needlessly punish businesses and consumers, which is what we're doing. And it's going to lead to an even more severe crisis in the future because things are shrinking, which then leads to the third crisis that I was talking about, where the middle classes are now leaving. So it's like they're voting with their feet. I have a cousin, he's an economist in the UK. He sent me an article last couple of days ago, where an economist from London School of Economics, where they said the number of nurses from Ghana to the British health system, NHS, had increased by 1,380% between 2019 and 2021.
Wow.
Over 1,000%. 1,300. So there's this silent outward movement of the very skills that we need, the well-educated people, and those are just nurses. We haven't even talked about architects and pharmacists and doctors and other.
And you think this is all because of the economic crisis?
Of course.
So,
and the government is not making things easier for them. You try to make a living, you have your savings, and someone gets up one morning and says, no, your savings do not belong to you.
Why? So do you think the IMF should have, because the way this works is you owe as a country. IMF is going to give you money. They want to make sure you're able to pay the money. So they're basically saying restructure your debts. Charity begins at home. So you can't expect Eurobond creditors to give you debt relief when the citizens have not paid a bit of the price. So I think the logic of the process is domestic debt exchange first, bilateral credit arrangement next, and then commercial Eurobond third. This is the logic of the process.
I get it.
So how is, I still want to understand how this is the IMF's fault. This is the government's own decision.
Yeah, it's the government's program. Yes, ultimately we bear responsibility. That's why I believe that we need to really engage the fund, because the fund also has the last say before they release anything. But we need to engage them for them to, know the limits of some of the proposals they're supporting and the need for us to hold the government more responsible for it. Because a government in the midst of a crisis that insists on building a cathedral can certainly not be taken seriously by anyone. Remember in 2022, that's when the president was insisting. So there are issues of expenditure, excesses and slippages that we need to confront. It could come from reducing the wage bill. But even that is very tricky, because if you look at the budget, I think about 10 different ministries account for about 96% of the total number of workers. Can we continue to put more people on the payroll, or should we at some point bite the bullet and carry out the necessary extensive reductions in the headcount in the public sector. It's something we need to face. But there's the point I'm trying to make is that the program as it is now can never solve our problems. It will only make it worse.
How will it make it worse?
Because you're undermining the capacity of the economy to grow.
But is that the program's fault? You're already shrinking before the program came in. And unless you're saying that the program directly encourages an economic situation where financial institutions are not lending to private sector and capital is being moved from private sector to government.
Yes.
But I'm not sure. I understand the problem. I'm just not sure who the cause is. Because government, for example, is borrowing from the treasury bill market. That obviously crowds out the private sector. But that's not an IMF policy. That's the government's own decision.
It's not an IMF policy, but it's within the IMF program.
So you think the program should identify this? But the program's objective is not economic growth. The program's objective is stability. Indeed, I interviewed the MD of the IMF a few months ago.
Yeah.
And I asked her, give me one adjective for where Ghana is. She says we want to stabilize. Her point was that you are going down.
Yes.
It's like somebody sinking in a ship. And we've come to say, here's a rope.
Yes.
Be still. What you do after that is your own job. So to blame her for the fact that you're not growing is funny.
No, I'm glad you said she said that.
She said stability.
Yes.
That was the adjective you used.
Yes. So, but you remember I said earlier that beyond stability should come growth.
Has any IMF program ever delivered growth anywhere?
That's precisely the problem, and that's the challenge. Because a program almost always creates conditions where growth is impossible after the program has ended. And because the IMF has a short time frame, which is 3 years, and when you go to their website, they tell you among their primary concerns is the fact that you should be able to pay them first. They don't want you to owe anything. And so that is their focus.
So you think it forces us to be short-termist in our economic?
Very much so. And
just to tidy up the books to pay back. Instead of solving the structural problems that will help you to not go back to them.
And that's why we are there 17th and we'll go back 18th. Because it's very short term. And you can't fault them in that respect. Because that's the scope of their mandate.
So let me ask you a question. From what you've said, we are certainly going to go. We went in 2022. It's a 3-year program. So we are ending in 2025.
6, yeah.
2025. Now, a lot of our payments are due in 2025, 26.
Yes.
Let's assume NDC wins power. You're still going to go back to the IMF.
Yes.
Because you owe them. A lot of your payments that have been deferred, like the 5 billion, are due in your first year.
Yes.
You're not going to all of a sudden, because there's a new government, attract financing from anywhere. So you're going to go back to the IMF.
Yes.
So what are you going to tell them? So are you? What's the point here? You're going to go back to them, and are you going to say that we are not going to come back to you with different conditions, or how are you going to negotiate that?
You don't necessarily have to go back, but we can begin the process of avoiding that now by taking the difficult decisions. The most difficult one, which we haven't done, is cutting back on expenditures and redirecting them towards growth. Because the economy must be able to grow for you to generate the necessary revenue to finance your debt and other expenditures. What is happening now is undermining that. So we need to be able to do that. One way of doing that, as I said, is the wage bill and the size of the public sector as a whole. We need to be able to cut that drastically and make that room, one, to finance whatever debt comes due, and more importantly, grow the economy. But you can also use policies to create the right conditions by removing certain taxes. COVID levy, all sorts of levies. We even have street light levy. And you drive around Accra at night and you wonder, what is the street light levy for? We have so many other things. So we need to bring relief to the productive sector of the economy, the real sector. It is the only way we can, one, grow the economy, because you cannot solve, even at the personal level, if you owe someone, you can only be able to pay that if you are working and earning money.
But Doc, if the macro stability is the basis for everything, that macro stability means you reduce your deficit. Reducing your deficit in English means raise your revenues, reduce your expenditure. All right. Raising revenue means you have to tax people more.
Not necessarily. You see, how
do you raise revenue without taxes?
You grow your economy.
And
you can grow the economy and even bring in more revenue at the same rate.
So if you grow the economy,
yes.
How does government get the money? It's either consumption tax or direct income
Exactly.
tax
Now
or
you
corporate
have,
tax.
so instead of someone paying, let's say, let's someone paying taxes on an income of 5,000 Ghana cedis. Now that the economy is growing and they are earning more, let's say 10,000 Ghana cedis, they will pay more now on 10,000 instead of 5,000. But the idea that you can address your fiscal challenges by increasing taxes.
So you are repeating what the NPP said. You can't tax your way out of a recession.
Well, I didn't know they said that.
They said that when they were in opposition.
Ah, well, so
You can't tax your way out of a crisis.
yes, you can tax.
But how do you grow an economy like Ghana's when nobody's lending you money, when your private sector is not very productive because most of their inputs are from abroad and therefore dollar denominated, so cost of production is high. Inflation is also high, meaning people can't afford to buy what they're selling. And then labor productivity is low. Agri productivity is low. How are you going to grow an economy which is in a crisis?
Yes.
Because you are saying it's growth that delivers.
Yes.
But how do you grow an economy in such conditions?
Well, first of all, you need to recalibrate your macroeconomy. So both fiscal and monetary need to be recalibrated towards economic growth and job creation.
Okay.
Currently, both our fiscal policy framework and monetary policy framework are very passive. They are also happy, oh, well, we have a primary surplus and deficit, and so what? To the degree that it doesn't lead to economic growth, you are not achieving anything. The the fiscal policy must be shown to lead or stimulate economic growth. The same thing with monetary policy. We need to recalibrate monetary policy away from price stability towards economic growth and employment creation. And it is through that we can bring down price stability. So there's the need for a more comprehensive approach, a more innovative approach to monetary policy and fiscal policy than now. The current approach doesn't help. Now, the Bank of Ghana, for some reason, believes that just by raising interest rates is going to reduce inflation. But as I said, it's harming the economy. The real source of pressure, price pressure, is in the public sector. So focus on that. Engage the government for them to bring down expenditure. You said the government itself, most of its spending is simply wasteful. I'm glad you mentioned productivity, where you are pumping money into a sector of the economy where productivity is so low. You go to a typical government office.
Do you differentiate the general public sector from the how shall I say, the political cost of running political government? For example, number of ministers versus, say, having people working at Senate or people working at GRA. Because when people say the size of government is too large, don't you think we need to qualify it so it's clearer? What are we saying? Are we talking about too many ministers, too many high-level paid people? Because we need more police people.
We don't.
At least we need more police presence in the country.
We don't.
You can drive for many kilometers and not have any police.
It is based on an old, but then you go to Accra, you see around 4 police officers sitting under a mango tree with their phone doing social. So it's a question of how you use.
So we don't need more police.
We don't. It's based on an old.
But we don't need more nurses. We don't need more teachers. We don't need more doctors. Working in the public service.
No, just 1 second. This is where the issue of productivity comes in.
Yeah.
How efficiently you're using the resources, including the human resources you have now. So if you have, and this is based on what I've seen, if you have 4 police officers wandering around Accra for 20, 30 minutes and then they go and sit under a mango tree and each of them is on their phone, that is not efficiency. And that reflects low productivity. You can do that, or let's say you turn on television during the week and a whole sector minister or the CEO of a state-owned enterprise is sitting there serving as a panelist, and this happens regularly, on a permanent basis, using government vehicles, government fuel. In the morning when they should be providing leadership, they are in radio stations and TV stations.
Defending the government achievements.
Doing all sorts of things. These are all signs of negative or low productivity.
You've been talking about this for a long time.
So we need to use public resources more efficiently. And by public resources, I mean financial resources, material resources, human resources, and so forth.
I'm going to take a break. When I come back, I'm going to talk to Dr. Nimotonsa about the cocoa sector. And I'm going to push him to give me 3 practical solutions that whoever wins the election should do. So 2025 is a very critical year. He's giving me 3 key things they need to do to set the economy back on track. This is the point of view. Don't go away. Welcome back. So the point of view tonight is talking to economist Dr. Nimoy Thompson, former DG of NDPC. We're getting into cocoa. Let me give you two quick facts about cocoa. It's now the third largest foreign exchange earner. Gold about 46 in terms of exports, oil about 30, cocoa about 11. Key point, cocoa output about 600,000 tons, the lowest in about 4 years. Syndicated loan was less than $1 billion. Interest rate was 8%. So meanwhile, within that period, cocoa prices reached almost $10,000 per ton, but we had forward sold our cocoa at a lower price. So the sector is in crisis. What's your one or two reflections on cocoa and how we got here?
Well, the first one is the shame of a country like Ghana still depending on cocoa as a core element of its development strategy after almost 150 years since it was introduced. We shouldn't even be talking about cocoa at all. By now, we should be talking about industry, high tech, and so forth and so on. Cocoa now constitutes just under 2% of GDP. And your national development strategy is based on a sector that makes up less than 2% of your.
But it's 11% of your exports.
Yes.
Of your export earnings.
Of your export
that's
earnings.
not small.
But it is. It's not even.
Your export earnings 11%.
Yes, but it's 1.5% cocoa loans on 1.5 billion dollars on average that we get. It's peanuts. For a country like Ghana that's growing, I wish I could show you the graph. I think I did it for 2009, 2010 period or something like that. Yes. The average that we get for cocoa loans is 1.5. The highest I've seen is 2.0.
Yes,
and then,
I have those numbers.
Yes. So $1.5 billion. What is that for a population of 31 million?
Because you're only using it to buy raw cocoa. So the syndicated loan is supposed to basically pay cocoa farmers for the cocoa beans, and then sell the cocoa beans raw and get the money back.
But then we've depended on it so much. Remember, in the past, even our budget cycle was structured around when cocoa syndicated loans were coming in. And they are insignificant. By now, we should have been doing about $10 billion through some exports. And this was
value-added exports, you mean?
Value-added. In fact, we call them strategic exports in the 40-year National Development Plan. So the fact that we are even talking about cocoa as the basis for economic strategy is and it reflects a lack of vision on our part. Personally, and this is my personal view, I think we need to restructure the whole sector in such a way that we leave the cocoa farmers alone, get cocoa board out of the way, let them make their money and pay taxes like anybody else.
How do you get that? So who buy? So does PBC buy the cocoa?
Who buys what farmers produce? They find markets. Let people do that.
But they call it a cash crop. The government depends on it for you need standards too.
No, those can all be handled. The issue of standards, and by the way, you should bring in Professor Alex Dodu one day for him to tell you about the role of standards and economic development and so forth. It's a fascinating presentation that he did. But after 150 years, we should let cocoa go and think of non-cocoa, non-primary commodity sectors.
So then our decline in cocoa shouldn't be a problem for you if you should let cocoa go.
But you do that simultaneously with a strategy for growing the other sectors. When we did the 40-year National Development Plan, we had three categories. We had traditional exports. We are not going to cancel them completely. But I'm saying leave the cocoa farmers alone. We've been screwing them for far too long. We go and pay, I forget the name they use for it, every year what the government pays them, and then they increase it, producer price. And then they say they are building houses for cocoa. Leave them alone. Give their money like anybody else. Let them earn. If they need services,
so
let
who
them
do
pay
they
for
sell?
it. The cocoa buying companies.
So the cocoa buying companies should buy.
They can go out there and buy. The point is that for 2% of your GDP, there's so much potential for growing other parts of the economy. Leave them alone. Let them have their money.
This is your personal view.
This is my personal
view. This is not NBC's view.
No. I've heard this for a very long time.
All right, cool.
That let's leave the farmers alone. And when we did the 40-year National Development Plan, we had three categories of exports. We had traditional exports. We had the usual non-traditional, and then we had what was known as the strategic exports. High value.
When did you do that plan?
It was supposed to start in 2018.
Of course, you're not in government, so you couldn't implement it. This government has introduced a 50-year plan, which they introduced 3 weeks ago. Have you seen the plan?
I've seen it.
Is it similar to yours?
No, it's a caricature of what we did.
So where are we now? So if NDC wins, are you going to use this plan? Are you going to start your own plan?
I don't know what NDC would do.
What would you recommend they do?
I think they've set a very dangerous precedent, because in just 7 years, we produced 3 long-term national development plans by the same commission.
And none has been implemented.
None has been, because they keep finding excuses.
So
the first time around, they said that it was too long.
This was the one you did?
Yeah, the one we did.
2015?
Yeah, we finished it in 2016, 2017.
You and Kwesi Botwe's team?
Yes.
And then the second one was which one?
That's by Professor Day. And he called it Ghana at 100.
And they didn't use that?
Well, I don't know what happened.
So the new one they launched
the new one is called Vision 2057.
So if NDC wins, would you advise them to use this one?
I wouldn't go there just yet, but there might be a need for recalibration, because the kinds of unambitious targets.
But how then are we going to make progress? We've had 3 development plans in 7 years. So don't you think that somebody needs to simply say, you know what, whoever has done this plan, let me just use it so that there's some continuity?
Someone will have to do that. Unfortunately, they said, listen, the thing is that how do you also work with something that sets you back? I'll give you an example.
How does it set us back?
They set a per capita. We had a per capita income by 2057 of over $50,000 based on specific targets that we were supposed to take to make us a high income country. The document they produced now has $8,500 as.
So the target is not ambitious enough.
8,500. That's the per capita income for Gabon today. So you are telling me that in 2057, Ghana's per capita income should be equivalent to Gabon's per capita income.
We'll look at that document in a full program. We have 3 minutes. Give me three quick things you think the next government ought to do, because it looks like we have 6 months for election, and whoever wins the election is going to be in trouble.
Okay. One, we need to recalibrate fiscal policy.
Okay.
To link it to local government. Currently, fiscal policy is all national, and so there's almost no link.
No fiscal decentralization.
No. It's almost non-existent. Before we left, we had the Local Governance Bill 2016, and when these people came, they found some faults with it, and I agree. The kinds of faults they found, I mean, they were legitimate concerns. And they started revising them. Unfortunately, it got stalled.
So recalibrate fiscal policy.
Recalibrate fiscal policy and make it more proactive towards growth. So it's not enough to boast about low deficit. Your deficit should drive economic growth. The same thing with monetary policy by the Bank of Ghana.
But it's still 1 point.
Yes.
Monetary and fiscal policy has 1 point.
As the macroeconomic framework,
so that's 1.
Should be growth oriented.
I need point number 2 because of time. Yes.
Yeah, number 2, you should link it to sectoral policies.
Okay.
So link macroeconomic policy to sectoral policies, i.e. growth. So, and not just growth, but employment intensive growth.
So like industrialization, manufacturing kind of thing.
Your policies should be seen to be facilitating that. So if you come in and start raising interest rates, you are not supporting growth. And then the third one is labor policies. So macroeconomic policy, sectoral policies, labor policies. And fortunately for us, and I must congratulate the current government statistician, Professor Samuel Inin. He's done a fantastic work by giving us a much wider and deeper set of statistics on the labor market, such that we can now actually change the discourse of development. Where now the finance minister will go to parliament and say, Mr. Speaker, last year we created 250,000 net jobs. Instead of this nonsense about primary surplus, nobody cares about primary surplus. But people want to know how many jobs were created.
So you use the data he's generating to formulate proper labor policy.
Proper labor policies.
To make labor more productive.
And that's what, exactly, because the labor productivity is also there. And we get to see that. Now, for instance, the data that he's given us, you do some preliminary analysis. You see, there's a term they call in labor economists the absorption rate, the same as the
of growth.
Yeah, of the economy.
Yes.
So the absorption rate used to be 64% or so. It's now down to 61. Now this is very useful information for making policy. That the Bank of Ghana, for instance,
so that then growth is linked to absorption of labor.
Exactly.
So that's the objective of economic policy, not just the number.
Not just the abstract things like primary surplus. Those people don't care.
Will you be involved in the campaign?
God willing, yes.
You will.
No, not the campaign, but in terms of policy. in the
Policy
future.
direction.
Yes, yes.
Thank you for talking to us, Dr. Nimoy Thompson. Always good to talk to you. Economist, former DG of NDPC. Really, really interesting insights on many things. We hope some of the suggestions are taken up by the authorities. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.